Hello and welcome. I'm Greg Johnston. I'm a senior application specialist with Sensors and Software, and I've been with the company for 26 years. If you have attended previous webinars or have watched the recorded webinars on our website, you know that I've covered many features of Echo Project, including the LineView and SliceView modules. This webinar describes how to use the interpretation module to add interpretations to GPR lines and extract information to include in reports. The interpretation module can be used with any GPR lines collected with a Noggin, LMX200 Enhanced, Conquest, or PulseEcho GPR system. It can also be used with the IceMap system. I have already started the Echo Project software and opened a project file with a GPZ extension. And here is the main Echo Project screen. Now you'll notice over here in Project Explorer, there's one line. This project actually consists of a single GPR line. As you see in the MapView window, this line zigzags across an area. And if we select the line name in Project Explorer and then check the Acquisition tab on the other side of the screen, we can actually see that this one line is 313 meters long. So I won't keep you in suspense. This GPR line zigzags across a couple of linear objects, utilities to be specific. And these are shown in the data as hyperbolas. And you can see these in the line preview here that we see a couple hyperbolas. And so this is a line that has zigzagged across these two utilities. So what we're going to do is we're going to add interpretations to these utilities so we can see their directions and spatial relationship in MapView. The first step is to open the GPR line in LineView. To do this, we can select the name in Project Explorer and then click on the LineView button up on the toolbar. The other option to open the GPR line in LineView is to double click on the name. So when I do that, double click on LineView, it opens up in the LineView module. Now we see the data in LineView, and what we see is all 313 meters of the line are displayed on one screen. So the first thing we're going to do is spread the data out horizontally by clicking the zoom button a few times. So I click on the zoom button, whoops, the other zoom button, the other direction. So I'm spreading the data out horizontally so I can see more of the data. I can zoom in and see more of the detail of the data. Once I do this, I now have a slider bar on the bottom edge so that I can move back and forth to see the entire data set. The next thing I'm going to do is play with the gain until I get a gain that I like. I'm going to change that one image there. Now the gain is defaulted to either the gain that was used when the line was collected out in the field or an auto gain. Either way, if the gain looks good, use that gain. But if you think that you can make it look better, use the gain drop-down list on the toolbar and change the gain from whatever it currently is to one of the numbered gains from 1 to 12. I'm not sure what the best gain is for this particular GPR line, so I'm going to start in the middle and select a gain of 6 and adjust from there. So there we go. There's a gain of 6, and 6 doesn't actually look too bad as a first stab. If I reduce it to 5, I can see, okay, 5's not bad, but I think I actually prefer 6. And we go to 7. 7's looking a bit too busy, so I think I'm going to stick with 6. Now, I'd like you to notice that as I scroll through the data, there seems to be two particular hyperbolas. There's a deeper one here and a shallower one. And because we're zigzagging across them, we see that multiple times. Deeper hyperbola, shallower hyperbola. So I want you to remember that because this is going to be useful in a couple minutes once we start doing the interpretations. The last thing I'm going to do before I start adding interpretations to the data is a velocity calibration, so I get accurate depth estimates of the utilities. To do this, I click on the hyperbola fitting button here. A hyperbola appears on the screen. I click it, and you see that the red hyperbola is superimposed on here. I'm going to fit the shape of one of the hyperbolas in the data. And if I pick this one here, now what I do is I grab the tails and I expand it until we get a good fit. And it's always a little bit, you got to fidget with it a little bit. But basically what I'm trying to do is follow the black band in here. You'll notice that I'm not picking the highest band. You don't have to pick the highest band. Pick one that gives you the best shape and the best overall. So I've got in there, and you know what? That velocity just isn't too bad. I think this one will work. Once I'm happy with the velocity that I've got, I click on the hyperbola button again. It asks me, do you want to update the velocity based on the fitting that I just did? And I'm going to say yes. Now I want you to notice that the GPR image does not change when I change the velocity. What did change was the depth scale on the side. Now the depth scale on the left side is more accurate than it was before. Now, depending on how your data looks, you may want to apply a background subtraction filter to remove any flat reflectors in the data. If I click on the background subtraction filter, you can see it filtering out the direct wave at the top of the image. But otherwise, this data is very interpretable. I don't really need a background subtraction filter to emphasize the hyperbolas. They are quite visible. So I'm not going to do background subtraction in this particular case. Your data might be different. Background subtraction is a fundamental way of cleaning up your data, emphasizing the hyperbolas so that they're easier to interpret. Okay, now we are ready to start adding interpretations to the GPR line. So what we're going to be working with is this toolbar here. This toolbar is the interpretation toolbar. And you will notice that several of the buttons have pictures of eyeballs on them. This is because an interpretation is an observation, some feature you observe in the GPR data with your eyes. The buttons on the interpretation toolbar are used to add, modify, and delete interpretations. We will go through the function of each button over the next few minutes. The drop-down list here, you'll notice on the interpretation toolbar, there's a drop-down list. This lists the currently active interpretation. Notice that right now it is set to none, and that's because there are no active interpretations in our data set. So let's add an interpretation to our GPR line. To do this, select the New Interpretation button. That is the button with the shiny eyeball on the edge here. This opens a dialog that looks like this. The dialog is used to set the properties of the interpretation that you are creating. Things like the name, the type of interpretation, the color, size, and shape. The interpretation properties can be entered manually, or you can select an interpretation from the predefined templates on the right-hand side. That will speed things up. Now, once you get familiar with creating interpretations, you will likely use the templates. But let's start with creating an interpretation manually so you can see all the properties that need to be defined. The first thing we do is select the type of interpretation that we'd like to add to the GPR line. There are 4 types of interpretations. And these are listed in the tool drop-down that I just clicked on. So these 4 types are annotations, boxes, points, and polylines. I'm going to show you all 4 types of interpretations, but let's start with a point interpretation for one of the utilities on the GPR line. So I'm going to select point. Now, let's give the point interpretation a name. Remembering that this GPR line has 2 utilities, one shallow and one deep, let's name this one Deep Utility. So there's the name. Now select what color you'd like the deep utility interpretation to be. I can go into the color, and I like red. I think I want my interpretation to really stand out. So yes, I'm going to go with the red that it had selected for me. Now I can click on settings, and this is where I can modify things like the style, border, the fill, the size. So for example, right now I'm using a circle. I've got this option for different shapes. I think the circle is going to work well. A red circle will be fine. I'm going to make it a bit bigger. Right now it's only 5 points in size. I'm going to make it 12 points in size so it really stands out. And over here in the little preview button, you can see exactly what your interpretation is going to look like. So I'm happy with the red circle. I hit OK, and I come out of there. And looks like I've fully defined my interpretation called deep utility. So I'm going to hit OK. I could actually, if I'm interested, I can fill in a descriptive terms of what this interpretation is. If I want to do that here, and that information is saved for later use. But otherwise, I'm just going to go with deep utility, and I'm going to hit OK. Now, what I want you to notice is that in this drop-down list, now deep utility is the active interpretation. I want you to notice as well that this button here was automatically pressed. This is the Add Observations button. It's a picture of a hand placing an eyeball with a little plus sign on it. This means that clicking anywhere on the data image will add the interpretation. The Add Interpretations button is automatically pressed on because usually when you create a new interpretation, you want to start adding observations on your data. So we save you one step by automatically putting you into Add Observations mode. Now we can add our observations to the GPR line. In this case, I'm adding my observations to the deeper hyperbolas I am interpreting as the deep utility. So let me go to the far end here and start interpreting. I'm going to actually narrow it down so there's a bit more data on the screen. And I'm going to move over here. And so again, I'm picking this deeper hyperbola here. So I'm going to click on the top of this one and the top of this one. So here I see them because remember I zigzag back and forth across the data. So I'm going back and forth across this same object. And so I'm adding interpretation. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking at the top of the hyperbola, the highest band, and the center of my interpretation appears at that point. Okay, let me get through. So I'm working through all 300 meters of data here. And let's see, give a few more clicks here. Whoop. And let me do that there. Okay, so I think, yeah, I'm at the far edge here. So I've added the interpretations to all of those. Okay, when I'm finished adding all my deep utility observations, I exit the Add Interpretations mode. So I depress this button, I press the button again, and so now I'm out of that mode. Now let's have a quick look at the fruits of our labors and the reason why we're spending time adding interpretations to the GPR data. I'm going to exit LineView and go back to Echo Project by pressing the big red X in the top corner. Now, don't worry, all our data, all the work we did adding interpretations is automatically saved. So now we're back at Echo Project. The first thing we notice now is that the interpretations we added are now shown in the MapView window. And lo and behold, the deep utility hyperbolas form a straight line, giving us more confidence that these hyperbolas are from the same utility. Now we also notice that the deep utility interpretations are on the line preview window as well. And if I change the zoom on this one, if I hit fit to window, you can see it zoomed all in. There's all my interpretations added. If I zoom a little bit, you can see each interpretation added to the top of a hyperbola. Now I should point out that the layer view window, this window over here, layer view is what controls what is displayed in the map view window and in the line preview window. So right now we can see our interpretations. If we don't want to see those, I can open up the little interpretations plus sign here, and I can unclick the point option. And all the GPR interpretations that are points will disappear. So I can toggle that back and forth, again, using the option in Layer View. Sometimes you want to do that. The most common reason is clutter. You have so many interpretations on your image that it's cluttering things up. So you just might want to turn it off to get a better view of the data. The other thing to notice over here in Project Explorer is that line 2, our GPR line, now has a little I next to it. Literally the letter I, a small I. This indicates that interpretations have been added to this line. This may not be a big deal when our project only contains one GPR line like this project, but this little I is handy when you have many GPR lines in your project. It allows you to see which ones have had interpretations added to them and which ones haven't. Okay, so let's carry on. Let's create another new interpretation, and this time for the shallow utility. So I'm going to go back into LineView. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, zoom in a little bit. And so I go back into the Create New Interpretation button. And this time I'm going to use a template. I know I want a point interpretation, so I'm going to click on the point template. And I notice that if I select that point template, everything's filled in for me. It's automatically set up as a point. It generates a color automatically. And I might want to, and it doesn't give me a name. So I will go in and I'm going to put a name because I want the name to be shallow utility. Okay. Now I'm going to go in here. I'm going to make the interpretation the same size. I notice that the interpretation is 6 points. I want it to be the same size as my other one, so I'm going to make it 12 points, like the other the other interpretation I made. So once I'm all happy with everything, I hit OK. And again, I'm immediately into Add Observations mode. I can add observations to the data immediately. Now, notice as well that shallow utility is now the active interpretation, and that's the one I just created. So I'm going to start adding interpretations here. I see a shallow utility here and here. Here, I think this is the one. Here. So I'll just work my way across the data, adding interpretations to each of these shallow hyperbolas. And you notice that I'm trying to click right on kind of the highest band of the hyperbola because that kind of defines the shape or defines the depth of that object the best. And we're going to be extracting this information. We're going to be using this information, so we want to be as accurate as we can. Okay, I'm almost across here. And okay, I think, oh, I got one more here. All right. Now, as I'm adding points, if I make a mistake, I can actually grab it immediately. If I accidentally click there, I can drag it over to a new location. The other thing I can do is, if I don't want this point, I can simply press on the delete button and it will delete the last point I put in. My other option is to click on a point, right click, and delete it. So there's all these different ways of moving and editing right as you're collecting the data. And if I hit the delete button more than once, it will backtrack and it will delete the last few interpretations that I put in the reverse order. Okay, after I'm finished adding the observations, I will exit the Add Observations mode by pressing the button a second time. So now that all the hyperbolas are marked, let's exit LineView and go back to Echo Project so we can see what adding the shallow utility interpretations did. Come back, it takes a second. We get a generation, generates the image in MapView. Okay, now we can clearly understand the relationship between the shallow and the deeper utility. They run in slightly different directions and cross one another right about here in the middle. Now let's create a new interpretation, but this time a different type. So I'm going to go back into LineView. I'm going to go back into the new interpretation mode, or new interpretation option here. And this time I'm going to use a template, and I'm going to create a polyline. So I'm going to create one called the horizon. I'm going to use the horizon template. And you see that it creates a green line as the interpretation. Now, if I'm super lazy, which I am, I can even get the software to automatically name the new interpretation by clicking on this button down below, which is called Auto Interpretation Name. And when I click on that, you can see that it automatically calls my interpretation Horizon 1. And again, when I hit OK, I come out of there. Horizon 1 is now the active interpretation, and I'm automatically in the mode where I can add observations immediately. Now, this is a polyline. This is a little bit of a different beast. So I'm going to zoom in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow a horizon. I'm drawing a line this time. So I look at my data and I say, well, okay, there's kind of a line running through here. So I'm going to draw that line using the Polyline tool. And you see what I'm doing. I'm moving along the image, and I'm just clicking to get the shape of the horizon that I'm trying to follow. And I can click as many times as I want or as few as I want. If I want to do a long straight distance, I can just click lines like that. And when I'm done, I double click to end the line. That will end the polyline. Now, I'm going to pick up another line here. I'm going to start, I wasn't quite sure where that line, the horizon, was down here. So I'm going to start collecting or adding a new line down in here. And so, you see what I've got. I now have two segments of the same polyline. And that's why it's called polyline and not line. If it was just a line, a polyline allows us to have different segments with gaps in them. Now, if necessary, as I'm drawing the line, if I need to move along, and I see, oh, I've hit the edge of the screen, well, I can jump down here and I can use the scroll bar to move the image along so I can continue. And when I go back on, I'm still right on the line, and I can continue drawing. And again, I hit one of these places where I'm not sure where the line goes, so I double click to end it. Now, as I'm drawing a line, if I make a mistake, I can do a couple things here. I can click and drag the point. So I can drag the point and move it to get the shape right. The other thing is, as I'm drawing the line, if I make a big mistake, I can hit the delete button. And the delete button will delete the last points that I put in and allow me to redraw the line. So there's handy little ways of doing that. Okay. And again, I have right-click features. So if I right-click, I've got options in here. Putting in a new line, if I want to start a new line, deleting the last selected point, or inserting points, which I'll show you in a few minutes. Okay, when I'm finished drawing, again, same thing. I come out of, oops, I created this. I'm going to delete it. There we go. When I'm done, I come out of Add Observations mode by clicking on this button again, come out of the mode. Okay, now let's create a third type of interpretation. This one's called a box interpretation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out to the full screen on here. I want you to notice, I notice in my data, every so often I've got these little U-shaped features in my data. There's 3 of them right in here. I'm kind of wondering what those are. So I'm going to put a box around them. So the idea behind a box interpretation is to mark an area of interest in the GPR line. In this case, I'm going to draw a box around these interesting U-shaped features. So I go into New Interpretation. I'm going to use the template. It's going to be a box. I'm super lazy, so it's just called Box 1, and it's going to be kind of an orangey color. Looks great. Hit OK. I'm right in the mode for adding interpretations. So I'm going to draw a box around this one, and another box, and I'm clicking and dragging. That's what I'm doing. I'm clicking and dragging the two corners of a box like you use in a lot of software for drawing things. So I put boxes around those three kind of odd features that I'm trying to understand a bit better. Now, after I exit from LineView and return to Echo Project, let's see what we get. Again, with all the interpretations, it takes a minute to generate. Now, two things have been added. Now, before we had the deep utility and the shallow utility dots, but now we also have, and let me turn off those points for a second so we can look at the other ones. Here's the horizon. The green line is the horizon I put in, and the brown or the orangey color are the boxes that I put in. So now I notice that, oh, wait a minute, those boxes the odd feature that I drew those boxes around seems to be associated with the point where the GPR turned around and was coming back in the other direction. So the boxes help me to quickly interpret the U-shaped features as a layer distorted when the GPR turns around while zigzagging. Okay, I'm going to go back into LineView and add the last type of interpretation, and that is the annotation. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to create a new interpretation, an annotation. Use the template. Name is fine, annotation 1 is fine, hit OK. And now wherever I click, it will allow me to put an annotation on the data. So for example, I might want to point out the spot where these two utilities are crossing one another. They're right over top of one another. So this point right here. So when I click on it, it asks me what I want to fill in for my text, and I'm going to say crossing point and hit OK. And so now I have an interpretation, or an annotation has been added at that particular point. So now our GPR line now has all four types of interpretations on it. So if I zoom in and show the full thing, you can see all the types, all the interpretations that are points, the polyline that I've drawn here on the boundary, and some boxes and an annotation. And again, when I come out of here and I go back to Echo Project, you can see all this in MapView. And let me turn the points back on. So we've got our points, we've got our boundary horizon that we drew, boxes are listed in here, and our annotation is also listed. And again, I can use layer view to turn individual interpretations on and off. Okay, I'm looking at my data, and let me just turn off the annotation and the boxes, try to clean things up here a little bit, even the polyline. And I'm looking, and I went, oh no, there's a mistake. You guys probably noticed it. The red dots coming across here. Look at this. It looks like that red dot should be here. Like if that utility is really coming straight across here, it looks like that dot should be there. So I should double check and see if I've got it in the right spot. And so here's another feature. If I'm trying to figure out where this is in my data, I can right click on the line preview screen and get it to show me the point in MapView. And you can see, if I just randomly click and say show in MapView, you see this flag appears at different points in the data. So if I say this point right in here, okay, right about here, so around 257 meters is where I think I've got a bad interpretation. So let me go back into LineView, and I'm going to go around, I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to move over to around 257 meters, and I'm going to look for a bad interpretation. Yes, right here, I put that dot, it's not close to the hyperbola, I made a mistake. So I want to move this interpretation to the correct location. So the first thing I have to do is make it the active interpretation. Right now, there's no active interpretation. So I'm going to go to the drop-down list, I'm going to make, that's deep utility, I'm going to make deep utility the active interpretation, And then that allows me to edit the deep utility interpretation. So I can then grab this interpretation, drag it over, and put it in the spot where it should be. Let's go back to Echo Project and make sure that that fixed it. Come back in here, MapView, updates, and you can see yes. Okay, now it's looking a lot better. The dots are coming right across in pretty much a straight line. So I feel a lot better about my interpretations now. Now I want to edit the polyline. So let's look at editing the polyline that I've created. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'll zoom in on this polyline area. And again, to edit the polyline, I have to make it the active interpretation. So I go to the drop down, I pick horizon 1, and now I can edit. So I can grab points and I can move them. I can shift them to new locations. I can click on them and say delete them if I want, anything like that. I can also delete a point by clicking on it, then right-clicking and deleting the selected point. And so you see that we can delete, we can move any of these points to try to define the shape of the polyline more accurately. Okay, another way to pick the active interpretation is to use the Pick Active Interpretation button. And this is the one with, it's literally a hand pointing. It's a finger pointing on a hand. So for example, if I click on that, then I can select the interpretation that I want to become the active interpretation. So for example, if I go over here to the box and I click on it, now you'll notice that box 1 is now the active interpretation. And now that I have box 1, now that it's the active interpretation, I can grab the edge, I can change the size of it, I can click on it, I can delete it if I want. I think I'm going to draw it back in, but anyway, so I have all those powers to edit it. Now, if I make annotation 1, which is, I only have the one annotation. If I want to edit it, again, I can click on the finger pointing, click on it. It's now the active interpretation. Now, I can do a few things. You notice there's a couple handles on here. I can grab this handle, and that will move the annotation, but it will keep the point that it's pointing at in the same spot. I can also do the opposite. If I grab this one, I can change the position of that, and the annotation stays in the same spot. If I want to edit the annotation itself, actually, if I want to move the whole thing, I can grab it by the words, and the entire interpretation moves. If I want to edit the words that are inside the annotation, I double click on them and then I can edit those. So that's how you edit the interpretations. Let's talk about some of the buttons on the interpretation toolbar we haven't talked about yet. So let's go over the eyeball button, the one we haven't used yet. The eyeball button is the Show Hide Interpretations button. It makes all types of interpretations except the active interpretation disappear. So when I click on it, you'll notice that everything disappeared except for the annotation 1, which is the active interpretation. And if I zoom out to the world so we can see everything, you can see there's no interpretations on the data except for this one point in here. So if I want to delete, if I want to make all the interpretations on my whole cross-section invisible, what I do is I set the active interpretation to none, and then I click on the eyeball. And you see that toggling back and forth. I can see all my interpretations. I can turn them all off. So that's how you manage interpretations and the visibility of them in LineView. The data button beside Add Observations. So let's go in here. Now you notice the one I'm talking about is this one. It looks like the Add Observations button, but it's got a capital A on it. This is for assisted hyperbola picking, and specifically we call it a smart point. Now I want to explain about this because it has a few implications. The idea of a smart point is to pick a hyperbola at the location that best indicates the actual depth of the objects that created the hyperbola. It is mostly used when extreme accuracy of the depth of an object is required. For example, when picking hyperbolas from rebar on a bridge deck. But it can be used when picking any hyperbolas. When the assisted picking button is pressed, the GPR line is pre-processed in the background before you can make any picks. And let me show you this. So if I click on this, and I'm on the deep utility as the active interpretation, and if I click on the add a smart point, it's going to process the data in the background. You're not actually going to see any change to the data image, but in the background, we're doing some fancy things with the data for the optimization of picking that point. Okay, so I'll give it a second to finish that finish processing the data. So now it's done. Okay, so now let me zoom out here so I can see, and I'm going to actually delete one of these points here, the deeper utility. Do that one. I'm going to delete one here, there, so that one's gone. Now I want you to watch what happens when I actually click here for with a smart point. So I'm going to purposefully not click on the top of the hyperbola. I'm going to click down here. And notice where the red interpretation appeared. It appeared way up here above. It wasn't actually anywhere near where I clicked. So when you add an observation, it does not necessarily appear exactly where you clicked. It jumps to the optimal location based on the pre-processing that we've done to the line. So the position of the observation appears on where it appears on the hyperbola is actually based on your selection of where you'd like the picks to be. And this is determined by a button called the Time Zero Offset Preference button, which is a very little known button. People don't use it often enough, but it's this blue button with an arrow on it. And when I click on that, this opens up. So this allows you to decide which of the three ways you'd like to pick the position of objects and layers in your GPR lines. The three ways are the traditional one, which is picking what we call the first break, which is the top of the highest band. So this is the default, and as I say, it's the traditional way that the position of an object is picked from a hyperbola or a reflector. The second way, the one in the middle, if I select it, is the top of the brightest band, which is not necessarily the top band. It's usually not the top band in the data. It's usually the second band. And I want you to notice, watch this watch the red interpretation right here, and watch what happens if I change my preference to picking the top of the brightest band. If I hit OK, you'll notice that that red dot is now moved down to the top of the strongest band. If I go back into this blue button here, let's look at the third option. The third option is to pick the middle of the bright band. So if I select that one and I hit OK, then you see that now the red dot has moved down, so it's the center of, in this case, the white band. So that's what this is all about. So the main reason we have smart points is that people tend to manually pick the wrong location on a hyperbola. You can see that if I go back to my preference here, if I go back to the traditional preference of the first break, you can actually see that the pick that it made was actually higher than where most people would pick manually. What I want you to note is that smart points assist the picking of a hyperbola, so they're not 100% perfect. If you click on a part of a GPR line that is nowhere near a hyperbola, it's going to pick something. It's going to pick the best point in the area, which may not even be a hyperbola. So, for example, if I come down here and I say, okay, I'm going to pick right here, it's going to pick the best spot in that area. It's going to try to assist you, but you have to give it a fighting chance by actually clicking near a hyperbola. Okay, so I'm going to delete that one. Okay, back to the interpretation toolbar. The next button is the interpretation properties button. This allows you to change the properties of the current active interpretation. For example, if I select the shallow utility, so I'm going to select shallow utility as the active interpretation, and then I click on the properties button, I get the same dialog that I got when I created that interpretation originally. So I might go in and I say, okay, maybe I don't want a blue circle. I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to change it to a diamond shape. So let's use a diamond shape for that particular interpretation. And now it's been updated, and now you see that the symbol has changed from that circle to a diamond shape. So you can change any of the properties, the shape, the color, any of those can change. The one thing you cannot change in the properties is you can't change the type of interpretation it is. So in other words, I can't take a point interpretation and make it into a polyline interpretation. You have to stick with the type of interpretation that it is. The next button here on the interpretation toolbar is a picture of a garbage can. And this is the button that puts you into delete mode. So for example, if I've got the shallow utility as the current active interpretation, and I want to delete observations of that, I can go into the garbage can mode, and you see the cursor becomes a picture of a garbage can, so it's a strong indication of what it is you're doing. And when you click on it, when you click on these observations, they will disappear. Notice that I cannot put one of the other interpretations in the garbage can because this one is not the active interpretation. This mode also gives you the ability to click and drag an area. So if I want to delete both these points very quickly, I can click and drag a box around them, and when I let go, all the observations inside that box will be deleted. Okay, I'm going to go back into data collection. I'm going to put those points back in. What I do want to note is there is no undo in here. So if you delete something you really didn't mean to delete, you can't just hit undo and have it come back. You have to either recreate it or so keep an eye and make sure that you're deleting things you really want to be deleting. Okay, when I'm going to select horizon 1. So when a polyline is the active interpretation and I use the garbage can and I go into delete mode, I want you to notice I can delete points. If I go up to a point, I can put that point in the garbage can. If the cursor is between 2 points, it turns into a pair of scissors. And that allows me to actually cut the polyline. You see, I cut the polyline and I left a gap in it. So I can delete that point. Now there's a gap. My polyline has become 2 segments in here. And so that's what that's for. I can delete points, or I can delete the line that's in between the points as well when I'm in delete mode with the garbage can. Okay, so I'm going to come out of that mode for a second. Now the last button on the toolbar is the Join Polylines button. And it's got a picture of a glue bottle on it. And it has a very specific task, and that is to join 2 polyline segments together. To use it, first I select the polyline as the active interpretation. It will be grayed out if you try to use like a point interpretation because it won't work. And now I can, so I click on the glue bottle, and the glue bottle comes over. It turns red when it detects the end of a polyline, and then I can click and drag over and grab another point and then draw the line in between them. Okay, and that's the function of that particular button. When I'm all done, I can exit by clicking on that button again. Okay, so we are finished looking at the interpretation toolbar, but I want to show you that as well. Keep in mind the right-click menu. Anytime, depending on what the active interpretation is, the right-click menu will have different features in it. And the one I want to show you is, again, if the active interpretation is a polyline and I right-click it gives me the option to insert points. And inserting points allows me to add points between points. So you can see I'm in insert mode. So I actually just inserted 3 points between those 2 points. It also allows me to add to the end of the line. So if I click there, it'll extend the polyline. Okay. So we can do sort of things like that. So the right-click menu is, the menu options are the context of what the interpretation that you're working with. So if you're working with points and you right-click, you see you've got different options in there. Okay, so they're appropriate for the type of interpretation that you're working with. Okay, I want to know, notice one more thing. In the right-click menu, there's this option called Copy Interpretation to Clipboard. And that's exactly what it sounds. It actually takes all the observations and it copies all that information to the clipboard. And it allows you to paste details of the interpretation into a Word document or a spreadsheet. But I don't typically use this option from here. I'm going to show you a better way of doing this a little bit later. Okay, having shown you all you can do with interpretations on one GPR line, I need to tell you that interpretations are not restricted to one line. They can span multiple lines. So this makes it possible to follow the same feature, object, or layer across numerous GPR lines. So I'm going to open another Echo project. I've already got one open here. So here's another project, and in this case, it's a grid file. And I'm going to select, you see I've selected all the Y lines in here. So in the Project Explorer, I checkboxed all the Y lines, and I'm going to open them all up in LineView. So it opens up, you see all of them are on the screen, and they all tile on the screen. If they don't tile properly, you can hit the tile button on the top here. And when I look at that, and I consider, okay, these are 9 lines that are all parallel to one another, and I've got 2 hyperbolas side by side. So odds are the one on the left is the same object. So I'm going to add interpretations to these. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to click on New Interpretation. I'm going to call this one, call it Utility 1. Actually, I've got to make sure it's a point. And it looks red, that looks fine. Utility 1, red dot, hit OK. I'm also right at the same time, I'm just going to create another one quickly. This time a point. This one's going to be called Utility 2. And hit OK. So I've got those 2. Now, the active interpretation right now is Utility 2. So I'm going to add observations to the second hyperbola, the one on the right-hand side. And again, I'm going to go to the top of the hyperbola, mark the spot as best I can. If I was super concerned, I'd probably zoom right in and get the spot as accurately as I could, but I'm going to eyeball it. So now I'm going to quickly change to Utility 1 and add observations to it. Now what I want you to know is this is different than what I did in the first time when we added observations. I'm jumping from line to line. I'm adding observations on different lines. And so there. Okay, so I've added those. Now when I jump out and I go back, you can see that those dots have now appeared in my MapView window. So the blue dot indicating the one utility running across this way, and the red dots indicating another utility running that way. Okay, so that was a long song and dance to show you all the ways to create, add, and edit interpretations. So now comes the why part. First, hopefully from the images that we've created so far, you are starting to see the power of adding interpretations to your GPR data. But some of you may say, why bother to go to all that work of adding interpretations when you can see the same thing by displaying the data as depth slices or in 3D? And so if we look at this image here, here's a depth slice. Here's a depth slice that shows a linear feature running through here and another one going in this direction. And so I say that's definitely a valid point. And I would be the first to say that if you see what you need to see using depth slices and 3D imaging, by all means use them. But in my experience, sometimes depth slices and 3D images are not that straightforward to understand. Here's an example. We've got a very, very weak response here. Are we going to pick up that that's a utility? You know, it's very gain dependent. If I don't have my settings quite right, I could easily miss that object. So the main reason that sometimes depth slices and 3D plots don't work very well, we can't see the object we need to see, is because of two things. Your target has to contrast with the host material enough to be visible. Okay, fundamental GPR right there. Got to have enough contrast. The second is you must be able to differentiate the responses from your target versus all the other objects and boundaries that are in the subsurface. Your target must have a different contrast compared to the other objects around it, or have a unique shape or orientation that allows you to differentiate it from other objects. If you don't have these conditions, then depth slices and 3D images can be difficult to interpret. Or sometimes what's common is your target is highly visible in part of the survey area, but in another part it goes deeper or it's attenuated, and for whatever reason it's harder to see in other parts of the survey area. So let's look at an example here. Here's a very weak hyperbola. You can actually, 3 parallel lines, you can see a hyperbolic response here, here, and here. They're all parallel. This is definitely some sort of linear object running between the lines, but we would never be able to get that to appear on a map, on a depth slice image, or in 3D, because the response is so weak compared to the other responses around it. And because depth slices and 3D are really dependent on that amplitude, the strength of the signal, that they become very difficult to see. But your eye can see this really well. We can look at this and I see a hyperbolic feature there. And that's when interpretations become very powerful. So the point is, and if you'll pardon that pun, adding a point interpretation to these type of hyperbolas allows you to see their spatial relationship in a map view. So this is the type of thing you get. You mark all the hyperbolas in an area with your interpretations, and you don't be selective. If it's a hyperbola, you pick it. And in the end, you look at it in map view, and you're going to see a series of point objects, like we have here, these random 1-point objects in here. And then here we see a series of hyperbolas that all line up. And our confidence just increased dramatically to say, yes, there's a linear object running through the area. There's my utility, or there's the foundation wall I'm looking for, or whatever it is your target is. Now, once you're convinced that interpretations are a good thing, and I hope you are, here's what we can do with them. So let me go back to project here, the data that we've been working with. So here's the zigzag image that we have of the two utilities that we crossed, zigzagging. And we've got all our interpretations added onto there. So let's look at ways that we can extract this information and put them in other places. So there's 7 different ways of getting data out. And so if you think about it, the simplest one is literally to send this image to a printer. Nice image, tells a story. I click on here and it sends it to a printer. I click on this button, I can copy it to the clipboard, and then I can paste it into a Word document. If I click on this option here, I can save the image as a JPEG or a bitmap or a PNG file, something like that. I can save it as a graphics image file. So those are 3 ways of saving your interpreted data. Now, the other 4 ways involve reports. And these are reports generated by Echo Project. And reports are all found under the Tools option. Tools, Report, and here they are listed here. I'm going to go over these reports fairly quickly because I'm running out of time. But I did cover Echo Project reports in another webinar. So if you need more details, go to our website and watch the webinar on Echo Project reports. So let me go through it. The first type of report is the GPR summary report. And so I can take an image with interpretations on it, and I can click on this green button to save the view, save that. And then when I go to create a GPR summary report, I can select that image and many more images, generate a report, and create a PDF. And within a few seconds, I have a PDF document that has images with interpretations in it. Okay, again, all the details are in that other webinar that I did. So if you didn't follow what I just did, there's a lot more detail about it in the other webinar. So that is the GPR summary report. The second way is to save and display interpretations on Google Earth. So as long as your GPR data was collected with GPS, or you input the relationship between your GPR data and the world coordinates into Echo Project, you can display your interpretations on Google Earth. Your data is saved as a KMZ file, and you can open up Google Earth. For example, if I do that with this data set, I can click on Tools, Report, go to the Google Earth report. It asks me what color do you want to show the lines. I'm going to make them red. It asks me where do you want to save the KMZ file. I'm going to save it right here. And then it automatically launches Google Earth and flies to the location. I'll give it a second here to find out. So it's going to zoom in right where the data were collected, and you're going to see the path, the GPS path, and you're going to see the interpretations. Let me zoom in. You can see the path, and there we go. And there's our red dots and our blue dots. And you can see that they're kind of overwhelmed by all the text that's on here. I'm not going to spend time right now showing you how to eliminate the text. I did that in the other webinar. Okay, so have a look at that. But hopefully between there you can see the red dots and the blue dots. Again, a very powerful way of looking at your data on Google Earth, and something that's very easy to send to a client. Google Earth is free, so if you send them a KMZ file generated from Echo Project, they don't have to buy anything additional. Okay, the next report is called a project report, and this saves the interpretations to a spreadsheet. That is a CSV format. And this type of file, I need to emphasize this, does not include any GPR images. It only lists interpretations. So let's generate this for the zigzag data. Let me go to Tools, Report, Project Report in CSV format. It asks me where I want to save it to. I select that folder. Now it's asking me, I have a polyline in there, and it needs to know how often to interpolate that polyline. And I'm going to go, well, 1 meter I think is fine. I'm going to go with 1 meter. And so now it's generating CSV files. It's generating a number of CSV files, one for each interpretation. And we have a bunch of them here. We have the shallow utility, the deep utility. We got horizon 1. We got boxes. We have the annotation. All those interpretations are now being saved to a CSV file. It will show me a bunch of those CSV files. Okay, so here's the folder, and if I arrange this by type, we can see that there's a bunch of CSV files, one for each individual interpretation. Now, I'm going to pick the one with all interps. This one is all by interp. So this is everything. This is one Excel spreadsheet that has everything every interpretation that we added to the data. Now, on the top is kind of a rundown of how many of each type of interpretation there is. There's one annotation, there's 3 boxes, there's 22 point interpretations for the deep utility, 22 point interpretations for the shallow utility, and 4 horizon 1 poly segments, polylines. Okay? And the information that we get in here is the XY, the local coordinate space, the depth of that observation, The most important stuff probably if you're mapping things is the GPS information. Here we've got the latitude and longitude. We also have UTM, easting, and northing in here. So really, if you wanted to take this into GIS, the most important columns are the lat long and the depth of the object. That's really the X, Y, and the Z, or the depth of the object. And being able to plot information like that are obviously very powerful. And as I scroll down, so the deep utility, these are all the instances of the deep utility, where they occur in XY space, where they occur in lat long space, and their depth. And I think the depth is actually, yeah, this column here. So all that information, all that quantitative data, that's what we have. We have quantitative information extracted from our GPR data. Okay, so again, no GPR images, just the location of interpreted objects and boundaries, which if you think about it is really the information that your customer is paying for. And the poll earlier saw 80% of you present your interpretations to data. And that's really what this is for. This is taking your interpretations and putting them into a table format so that you can give them to your customer. Okay, I'd really like you to understand the power of having GPR interpretations in a spreadsheet file. So one of the things I can do is generate a surface plot of subsurface boundaries. So a lot of people are looking for objects. So they're looking for hyperbolas in their data and they can map where they go. But some of you are geotypes or that sort of thing. You're looking for boundaries. And I want to show you what you can do with a boundary. And here's, if I jump back to my PowerPoint, here's a photo of a GPR survey on a freshwater lake. Obviously no odometer wheel to trigger the data collection. So it was collected in free run mode. And the positioning of the survey is done with GPS. So I'm going to jump back to Echo Project, and I'm going to open up a data set, a bathymetry data set. And here you can see the path of where lines were collected in the water. And here you can see a close-up of part of the bathymetry data where we've got water and then you got the bottom. And I've taken the time and I've added an interpretation to the bottom reflector. And so I want to take that information and do something with it. So my option here is to output it as a CSV file. So if I take all this and I output it as a CSV file, I have that polyline information from the bottom of the lake as a polyline. In the polyline, I have all the details, the latitude, longitude, and the depth. And from that, I can generate something like this. So here is taking all the polyline interpretations and plotting them as a surface. And this is a surface of the bottom of the lake. Now, I want to note that this surface plot was not done in Echo Project. It required a third-party plotting software called Surfer, which is done by Golden Software. And I know some of you are going to be familiar with that software. But the point is that it allows you to extract, Echo Project allows you to extract that information so that you can make these types of plots. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do, the last type of report that we're going to look at is the CAD report. And I'll try to be quick on this one because I know I've gone over time. Okay. So you'll notice that under Tools, Report, there's one called CAD. And CAD allows us to save the data to a DXF file. And again, it's exactly like the CSV file. There's no GPR image in there. All it is are the interpretations. But in this case, we also keep the path. We also plot the GPS path of the GPR survey. And when I select that type of report, it actually asks me what coordinate system am I going to use in the output. I either use the local coordinates, the project report, the UTM, or the lat long. Now, I'm not going to generate the report right now because it does take a minute or so. So I'm just going to jump to the final result here. So here's the data plotted in a CAD viewer. This isn't a full CAD program, but it is a CAD viewer, so I can show you what the data looks like. So here you see the GPS path of when we collected the data over that zigzag file format. And you can see that I can see this in 3 dimensions, so I can move this around in 3 dimensions, look at it on edge and that sort of thing. Now, if I turn off the path, if I turn off the GPS path, you can see the interpretations in here for the shallow utility and the deep utility. The little dots, the interpretations there. So the idea is that someone with a full CAD program would use the interpretations to add the utilities to a CAD drawing. At this point, I'm going to say thank you for attending the webinar today. I hope that you learned something useful, and that's going to make you a better GPR practitioner. So I thank you for attending. And please feel free to contact me with any questions you have using the email address listed on the screen. I hope to see you again at the next webinar. We will send out an email with a link to allow you to register for that webinar. Until then, bye for now.